Everybody, welcome back to the Gospel Echo podcast. Today we're having Dr. Jason Lyle, who spends a lot of his time studying things like the flood and creation and dinosaurs. And we're going to dive deep into that topic with him. We're going to talk about dragons. We're going to talk about dinosaurs. We're going to talk about Noah's Ark. We're going to talk about the flood. We're going to talk about what things are going to look like when we're in the new heavens, the new earth, as far as animals go. And it's a really fascinating conversation. So if you've heard the views of evolution or the secular worldview and you'd like to know what the Bible says on the matter, please join us today on the Gospel Echo podcast. I've known of you for a while. I bought The Ultimate Proof of Creation a while back. And were you on the road trip to truth?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing you on that. But I've been listening to more of your stuff lately, and I think that the subject matter is fascinating. I mean, everyone probably tells you that, but it really is. So I just wanted to begin with a quick question about kind of as a foundational thing here. How old is the Earth, and how do we even know that?
Okay. The Earth is a little over 6,000 years old, and we know that because of the information given in Scripture. The Bible tells us that God created the heaven and the earth and all that's in them in 6 days. That's Exodus 20:11. And in fact, those are the same days as our work week, because that's Exodus 20:11 is the explanation for why we have 7 days in a week. And we know from those genealogies, God gives us enough information about the age of a person when they begat the next child, when that person begat the next child, and so on and so forth. And you can add up that information along with some other information regarding certain decrees and so on. The prediction in Daniel that the Messiah would come in 77's 490 years. And we know that the Messiah came about 2,000 years ago. So you add that information up, and it's about 6,000 years ago.
So why do secular scientists in universities and the professors there, why do they have such a different outlook on that?
Well, primarily because they've been taught that, and their professors have been taught that, and so on for quite some time. But the foundational philosophy behind it is a philosophy of uniformitarianism, which is the belief that present rates and conditions are similar to past rates and conditions. And so when interpreting past events, we should assume a priori that those events were generated by the kinds of slow and gradual processes we see operating today. And and one implication of that is they automatically dismiss the idea of a global flood. And the global flood would obviously lay down sediment at a much accelerated rate than what we see happening with the slow and gradual deposition we see today and the minor catastrophes we have today, which are nothing compared to the global flood. So that's one of the reasons. And the reason that they must hold to that philosophy is, well, not that they have to, but in order for evolution to be sensible, Darwinian evolution, it requires millions of years, because we all agree that you can't turn a frog into a prince immediately, like you see in the fantasy literature. But the idea is, given enough time, basically anything can happen. And so it's a necessary prerequisite for evolution for the Earth to be billions of years old.
So is Darwin's theory of evolution their Bible, so to speak?
It really is. It's and I'll grant the uniformitarianism came first, and then that paved the way for Darwin. But if Christians had been strong and had rejected the millions of years when it first came up in the 1600s, 1700s, really, Darwin would have had no room to play with. So that really is the guiding principle, at least today, in terms of why secularists would be unwilling to even reconsider the idea that the Earth could be thousands of years old. They're not going to be open to that idea.
Yeah, but like from an anthropological perspective, and you look at all the different civilizations that have existed in the commonality of the flood story, how do they account for that? How do they just dismiss the flood? I mean, I know they want to because nobody wants to be accountable for their sin when they're not saved. But how do they try to do that in a credible scientific way? Oh, the flood didn't happen.
I don't think there is any credible way to reject that, but to reject all these different flood legends. But I think what they would generally say is, well, floods were common in the ancient world, and so a lot of different cultures have flood stories. which they do. But uh, the interesting thing is, if you look at a lot of these different flood legends, the parallels to the scriptures are eerie. And of course, I would say that the account given in Genesis, that's the original historical account. It gives very specific information. And then some of these other legends, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which includes a legend of the flood, those would be later, because some of the stuff in that doesn't make sense. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ark is a cube, which would really not be stable. The biblical dimensions, we've had engineers study that, and it's designed to weather a flood. So that's the original account. But yeah, I don't think that secularists have a really good way of explaining the fact that there are over 200, and I forget the exact number. It's probably increased. Over 200 flood legends from different cultures all over the globe.
Yeah, and you said their rebuttal to that would be that, well, every culture has flood legends, but there was obviously no international communication. Isn't it kind of amazing that they all have one? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and the fact that a lot of those legends include certain details like humans and animals being saved on a boat. In many of them, God or the gods were angry, and that's what initiated the flood. But there's one person who found favor in the eyes of God or the gods. I think in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the name's different. Instead of Noah, it's something like Utnapishtim, or something like that. But a lot of the things are common. The building an altar and sacrificing after the flood is over, and so on. Now, not all the flood legends have all these details, but a lot of them do. So it's an indication that, yeah, this event really happened.
And is the Epic of Gilgamesh the Mesopotamian account?
It is. Yeah.
Okay, and that's what part of the world would that be today? Is that Iraq, Iran?
Yeah, that area. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just so our listeners know, not everybody's familiar with that. Um, so, speaking of the flood, for people who haven't studied this too in depth, obviously the ark carried all the animals, and the Bible doesn't, I don't think, gives really an accounting for all the sea animals. Do we know how many sea animals were left behind to survive? I mean,
Well, if you're asking how many sea creatures became extinct, I don't have the exact number, but not. I mean, obviously, none of them have to go on the ark, and I mentioned that because there are critics who have claimed that. They're like, "How did Noah get whales on the ark?" And I'm like, "Oh, come on, read the scriptures. It's two of every air-breathing land animal, everything that creeps on the earth, and that would not include whales. They don't need to be on the ark to survive." That being said, the flood was violent, and it's dumping in some cases miles of sediment very rapidly. There were whales that were killed in the flood, but the point is, all you need is two to survive, and find each other and reproduce.
and Dr.
So
Lau,
there are water creatures that, as far as we know, are not around today, but that may have been killed during the flood. Trilobites were these little. They're not insects. They're in that kind of category, like horseshoe crabs, things like that. And they're invertebrates, and they filled our oceans before the flood. And as far as we know, there's not one trilobite left on the earth today. So those were sea creatures that perhaps went extinct during the flood. We don't know exactly when they went extinct, but they were abundant before the flood.
that's interesting. And you just alluded to all you need is two, meaning you only need two kinds of an animal. Could you flesh out for the listeners why you only need, for instance, say two house cats, and you could eventually end up with lions and tigers?
Yeah, actually, we think the cats that would have been on Noah's Ark would have been closer to the wild kind. They wouldn't have been house cats. Those would be what comes later. But yeah, you only need two of each kind. You need a male and female of each kind, and a kind. People say, well, how does that fit into our modern classification system? Probably somewhere around family or genus level, and it could be different for different animals because there's no reason why our man-made classification system would have to line up with the biblical kind, at a level per level. But we know that you can get different breeds of all the different breeds of dog. Those are all recent. You only need two dogs on Noah's Ark. They would have been more like the wolf variety, because wolves have a lot of what we call heterozygosity, which means they have differences in their genetic code, which allows for variation in their offspring. And then when you get down to something like a Chihuahua, you have very little heterozygosity. They're mostly homozygous, which means they can't generate a lot of variety. But the animals that God would have selected to go on board the ark would have had a lot of heterozygosity, and therefore they could have produced different breeds. after the flood. All the breeds of dog are recent. The different varieties of cat, we do think all cats are related. So they're part of the same Genesis kind. So the lion that you see at the zoo, and then that little thing you come home and pet in your house, those are related. They're both descended from cats that would have been on board Noah's Ark, two cats that would have been on board Noah's Ark. And then you can get all those different varieties later. You can even get different species. That confuses people, but the species is not the same as a kind. You can get different species from a common genus in some instances. There have been documented cases of that. That's just, again, these are man made classification systems. What you don't get are multiple kinds from one kind. Kinds are the biblical limit of variation that God has imposed on creatures.
And what you just explained, is that widely known throughout the scientific community?
Among creationists, it's very well known.
Okay.
Among secularists, I don't know if they, I mean, the secularists don't believe in discrete kinds because in their view, if they're holding to an evolutionary view, there is no separate, all life's related. So there's only one kind in the evolutionary view if we defined kind as a reproductively isolated organism. They would say no, all organisms are related. So there's only one kind. In the biblical worldview, there are thousands of kinds, separate kinds that God created back at creation, and they have the ability to diversify within their kind, but not between kinds.
So, did they just cite Darwin as proof that supposedly that evolution is true? I mean, how do you get from a sea animal that was the size of a whale, started walking on land, and eventually became a rhinoceros or something? How is Darwin the justification for that?
Yeah, I mean it's storytelling is what it is. You'll get these stories about, well, this animal became, something like this and something like that. And knowledgeable evolutionists will not point to the fossil record. Amateurs will. They think that how do we know evolution? Fossils. And I'll say, okay, which fossils? And can you show me? Can you demonstrate evolution from the fossils? And then what they'll do is they'll show variation within a kind. They'll show like different varieties of horse, and there are varieties of horse that, the modern horse has the single toe, but there are some ancient kinds that had three toes. That was just part of the variation built into that kind. And they'll say, there you go. And I'm like, well, those are variation within a kind. What you don't find in the fossil record is one kind becoming another. And granted, there are always a few claims, but those are inevitably refuted even by the evolutionists themselves. So aside from a handful of disputed specimens, we really don't have a good fossil evidence for Darwinian evolution, nor do we have good genetic evidence for it.
And so, if we were really to get to the bottom of why there's such just a massive disparity between secular scientists and creationists regarding evolution, fossils, the fossil record, the origins of the earth, can we just attribute that to Romans 1 and the fact that they're suppressing the truth and they have a desire to do that?
Ultimately, that's the case. But evolutionists also suppress discussion of alternatives. They really do. My friend and colleague Nathaniel Jeanson just wrote a wonderful article on that on the Answers to Genesis website, which I highly recommend. The fact is, most evolutionists have never been properly exposed to creation science, the evidence that is consistent with creation. Well, I mean, all the evidence is consistent with creation, but they've never seen someone defend that and show logically how the evidence is consistent with creation. They've only heard the evolutionary story. So I think a lot of it's Romans 1, and then a lot of it is just ignorance based on the fact that's all they've heard. They've only heard one side of the story.
And I've seen a documentary that Ray Comfort did on evolution, and he interviewed some of the, mostly notable people who support evolution. And what was interesting is there wasn't really much uniformity in their answers. It doesn't seem like that community has even come to a consensus. Is that something that you find to be common? At least all I know is when you speak to lay people about it, the vibe in the room is that evolution is obviously true, and if you don't believe that, you're an idiot. But on the other hand, they don't even have a uniform answer, it seems like.
Yeah, I think in terms of the specific mechanisms, that's true. I think most evolutionary scientists would, I think they would, no, everybody believe we know evolution's true. We just don't know all the details of how it happened. And I'm thinking, well, if you don't know the details of how it's happened, how do you know that it's true? I think those two things are connected. But yeah, there's a lot of disagreement, even in the secular community, in terms of, did birds evolved from dinosaurs? I mean, they all agree that birds evolved from reptiles, but did they evolve from dinosaurs specifically? Did they go, kind of ground up or tree down? Things like that. Whether or not dinosaurs had feathers, things like that, how they died, how they lived. There is a lot of disparity within the secular community, but they do seem unified in their conviction that evolution is true. And to me, it's a blind faith. It's fideism. They have confidence in something, but they don't really have good evidence for it.
Yeah, and I think there's also an element of spiritual warfare to that. You know what I mean? The idea that if you're the one guy in the room who doesn't believe in evolution, it's not that just they disagree with you. It's just you're made out to be honestly like kind of a moron. And I think the 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 attack to try to make you feel belittled and inferior and very foolish is just part of a element of spiritual warfare when it comes to that topic.
Yeah, I think that's true. You might think, well, scientists would be above that kind of bullying, but and some are, but a lot are not. And you will see that. You'll see that rhetorical tricks rather than logic being used to persuade people. Well, nobody seriously believes in creation anymore. I recently read through the transcripts of the arguments that the scientists wrote out for discussion at the Scopes trial, and it's 100 years ago, 1925. And even they were using that. They'll say no intelligent person seriously believes that God created 6,000 years ago. And I'm like, well, that's a rhetorical trick. That's trying to intimidate somebody by saying, well, if you believe that, you're simply unintelligent. That's not a logical argument.
No, it's an attack. And I think part of the proof that your idea is bad is that you have to resort to that. As you were saying earlier, they suppress even any conversation about a rebuttal to or an alternative to evolution. So, assuming evolution isn't true, which you and I both know it's not, I have a very, to me, interesting question. Were humans alive at the same time as dinosaurs?
Yes, and again, that goes against the narrative because we've been told that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. A lot, maybe an asteroid's what did that, and so on. But biblically, we know that God created in 6 days a few thousand years ago, and He created all the land animals on day six, everything that creeps on the earth, and that would include dinosaurs. They're land animals; they creep on the earth, so they would have been made on day six. That's the same day that human beings were made. So yes, dinosaurs did live at the same time as people, and that upsets people because they think, well, wait a minute, I've seen Jurassic Park, and we know dinosaurs are these monsters that go around trying to eat lawyers, and but biblically, all the animals, everything God made originally was very good. And just because an animal is big doesn't mean it's evil. I mean, you can go to the zoo and see elephants, and they're wonderful animals. They're not evil. Now, you don't want to make one mad because they are powerful animals, but they're not evil. And originally, dinosaurs would have been gentle creatures. They would have been peaceful. They would have been vegetarian. That surprises people too. But all animals were originally vegetarian. Even animals that have very sharp teeth originally were vegetarian because God gave the plants to human beings and to animals to eat, and there would have been no meat to eat before death entered the world. Meat is a dead thing, and so before Adam sinned, there was no death in the world of living creatures, and so dinosaurs would have lived at the same time as people, and that would have been a wonderful thing because everything God made at that time was very good.
And so in Genesis, obviously, there's the dominion covenant where Adam's given dominion over all the animals. Is there any anthropological evidence or any evidence otherwise that shows us what the coexistence of dinosaurs and mankind was like after the fall? Were people being eaten, or did man find a way to kind of subjugate dinosaurs like it does other wild animals?
There's evidence of both. There is evidence of dinosaur. Now, they wouldn't be called dinosaurs, but there is evidence of there are legends of dragons. And if you think about what a dragon is, that's really the ancient word for any sort of monstrous creature, a monstrous reptile. And there are legends of heroes going out and slaying dragons. There are legends of dragons causing problems, coming in, eating livestock. There's the legend of St. George and the dragon, where a town was being victimized by this dragon that was eating their livestock. The people were going to sacrifice a young lady to this thing, hoping it would leave them alone. St. George rides in on his horse and slays the dragon. And he was a Christian, of course, so he preaches Christianity, and many people converted according to the legend. That's not in the Bible, and we don't know for sure that that happened, but it could have happened just like that. So there were dragons, dinosaurs that were causing problems. And then there's evidence that in other cases they were subjugated. Marco Polo in AD 1271 reported that Chinese royal chariots were occasionally pulled by dragons, which again would be the ancient word for anything resembling a dinosaur. So and there are lots of legends in China. Apparently, if you were wealthy, the thing to do was to raise your own dragons because they were very rare. So only wealthy people could afford to pay someone to go and find one and capture it. In the year 1611, we know from historical records that the Chinese emperor appointed the position of royal dragon feeder. So there was a job where your job was to feed the dragons, which makes me think they probably had some. And again, I would speculate those were probably dinosaurs.
And were they only used as sort of a token of royalty, or is there any evidence that they were eaten? Were they hunted? Were they eaten by people to meat?
That I haven't been able to find information on, other than that they were relatively rare, and therefore people of wealth and royalty would tend to be the ones that would be most likely to have one of these rare creatures at that time. But I haven't in my research read about anyone eating the meat of one of these creatures. They may have, but I haven't read about it.
Okay, so that brings up a new question, which is kind of an obvious question. How did they go extinct? Apparently, they weren't wiped out in the flood, if these dragon legends have any truth to them in the 1600s.
Yeah, so we do think they survived the flood. Well,
Some of them.
all the kinds survived the flood because they were all on board Noah's Ark. We do think that dinosaurs never reached the same population after the flood as before the flood. Maybe because the environmental conditions were different and not as conducive to reptilian life, more conducive to mammals and so on. But in any case, yeah, these are post-flood. All of these are post-flood legends, and so apparently people saw them after the flood, and apparently they went extinct gradually. And we don't know the mechanism other than to say it wasn't just the dinosaurs. Lots of things have gone extinct since creation. I mentioned earlier trilobites that used to fill Earth's oceans. And today, as far as we know, there's not one trilobite left on the Earth. So those are gone. Woolly mammoths were once abundant in North America. And we know that. We have fossil evidence of them, occasionally frozen in a glacier. Today, they're gone. There are lots of reasons, lots of specific reasons why things can go extinct. Disease can come through and wipe them out. Famine can come through, wipe them out. Change in the environment, and they just kind of gradually dwindle out. Uh, Human caused extinction directly, where human beings have gone out and slayed. I've read all kinds of legends of heroes slaying dragons. Well, there you go. I mean, that's one way to wipe them out is we just go out and specifically kill them. So, but the ultimate reason why we don't have them is because Adam sinned, and we who are descended from Adam continue to sin, and that Adam's sin brought death into the world. And so if that had never happened, if human beings had never sinned, we'd still have dinosaurs in the world. They'd still be peaceful. They would be vegetarian, but Adam blew it, and for that reason, eventually they went extinct. But the specific details we don't know. That's still a topic of research.
So when you see a passage like Isaiah 65, where, I mean, depending on your view of eschatology, it's about the millennium or about the future new heavens, the new earth. It talks about when the curse is mitigated a certain amount, not completely gone, but mitigated, and you have like the wolf or the lion weighing with the lamb and a baby human near a serpent that won't bite it.
Mhm.
It's a very interesting picture of what's to come. Do you believe in the new heavens and the new earth, or in the millennium? I don't know what your eschatology is. Do you think there will be dinosaurs?
That's a good question. I do. I think in the new heavens and the new earth, which is it's new in one sense, it's restored in another sense, according to Acts chapter 3.
Mhm.
So perhaps a bit like the way our bodies in the eternal state will be, in one sense, a continuation of the current body, and yet glorified. So perhaps the earth is the same way. It's a resurrected earth. It's a new earth, but it's a restored earth. And so I think there will be dinosaurs in it, and they will again be peaceful creatures. And of course, a lot of people with Isaiah, those latter chapters in Isaiah that there's some it talks about new heavens and a new earth, and there's a lot of people hold to an already not yet eschatology where there's some aspects of the new heavens and new earth that are already in place, but others that have yet to be filled. Obviously, we still have death in the world. The curse is still active. and so we're not completely in the eternal state yet. There is yet in the future a consummation of all things. And I don't get into the details of eschatology, but that is something I would stand on, is that we are not yet fully in the new heavens and the new earth. But there's a sense in which if you're in Christ, you're a new creature, you're a new creation. And so that process has started, maybe is a good way to say it. And we have seen examples of lions that have gone back to their vegetarian diet. So that could be an aspect of the already yet not yet. Most lions still haven't, but Little Tyke was a 350-pound female lion raised in captivity. She went her whole life. She lived 11 years and never ate meat. She liked milk and eggs, but she wouldn't eat meat. And again, there are passages in Scripture that prophesy in Isaiah's future that would happen. So we're seeing perhaps the beginning of that.
That's very interesting. And one thing I've always wondered about, C.S. Lewis talked about something called the true myth. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there are myths in the world, and then there's the actual true myth, which is sort of a paradox and a contradiction. It's the real, actual, ultimate reality and truth that the Bible alludes to. Do you think it's, I guess a better way to ask it, all these things in the Bible, like dragons, for instance, what do you think it is that causes that to be in the human mind? What I mean by that is, if that sounds weird, there's still movies about dragons. There's one out right now. It's like How to Train Your Dragon or something. Why is it the things that collectively fascinate humanity are all the things that we find in the Bible?
The Bible is it's true, but it's also the best story ever told. And I've always argued that the best movies parallel the Bible in some way. The movies that I really enjoy um, follow the same script because it rings true. It's because the Bible's true that the best stories parallel that. Even like Isaac Asimov, who wrote these wonderful science fiction stories, he was an atheist, but he often incorporated biblical themes into his stories because it works. The human mind is designed to embrace truth, and the truth that is the truth is that God's word is true. And so, for example, many stories will have either stated or implied an initial condition that's wonderful, everything's great, and then some evil is introduced, some problem is introduced into that society or for that person. And then someone else comes along who is not responsible for the problem. A hero is raised up who deals with this evil and conquers it, and you have a return to a happy state. And if you think about it, a lot of movies parallel that theme in some fashion. And so I think that's one reason, and dragons are just one example of that. God made some amazing animals, and people in the past who saw these animals, these enormous creatures, these dinosaurs that today the bones of them will fill a room in a museum, and that impresses us. And I think that's one of the reasons God made them, is to display His power. And the fact that they're not around anymore creates a little bit of a mystery. And so that really captures our imagination, which is why you see movies about either dragons, either the fictionalized version, or dinosaurs. I mean, there's just recently been a new Jurassic World movie, and I saw it even though I knew it would be basically what all the other ones are, monsters running around trying to eat people. But there's something about that is exciting to us, and partly because they're mysterious, and then partly because they're big and they display God's power.
Yeah, and I think one of the fascinating things is when you look at like Marvel movies or DC Comics, you've got Batman and you've got the evil Joker, right? You've got the Dark Knight, you've got a savior figure who's coming to save everybody. Deep down, everybody knows that we need that. And then
Exactly.
you have,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
There
and
was a
then,
theme in the Superman in particular. Superman has often been um, recognized as being a sort of a shadow of Christ, right? I mean, because he's sent from his heavenly Father to the earth. He has sort of two identities. One of them is just an ordinary human, that's the Clark Kent, and then the other is essentially divine, and that's Superman. And in the Superman Returns, the Brandon Routh movie from a number of years ago, uh, the gospel theme was there, even though the producer is not a Christian or anything. The gospel theme was there. There's some line he says, you say that the world doesn't need a savior, but how can that be when every day I hear them crying for one? Something along those lines. And I thought, boy, that's beautiful. that's a shadow of the gospel right there.
It is amazing how sometimes you see in movies that unsaved hearts echo they echo the gospel and the cries of the unsaved heart for what they really, really need. And the last example I would give would be Marvel movies. We know as Christians that everybody has eternity in their hearts, and it seems like in those movies there's always a battle for evil winning out or good winning out for good, for the long haul. And so there's all these interesting themes and dynamics in the best-selling movies, and I find it kind of fascinating that most of the people that watch them wouldn't necessarily pick up a Bible or take a Christian worldview very seriously, but they can't get the Christian worldview out of their own system. And then
That's
I
right.
wanted to ask you about also, because you alluded to earlier, God made some magnificent creatures. I want to ask you, when did the word dinosaur first appear in the English lexicon? Is that an ancient word, or is that more of a recent phenomenon?
It's modern. It was invented in 1841 by Sir Richard Owen, and who was a creationist, by the way. And the word means terrible lizard. But yeah, the word dinosaur didn't exist before 1841. That's why you won't find it in older translations of the Bible. And frankly, I think newer translations are kind of following the patterns of the old ones, so they're not updating it. But it is a modern word. The ancient word that would be used, like if a person before 1841 had seen a dinosaur, the word they would have assigned to it would be dragon.
Right, which is fascinating. I don't want to go down this rabbit trail, but when the serpent first appears in Genesis, isn't that word a triple entendre, meaning dragon somehow? Hamash or Namash or something?
I think the word is nakash, if
Nakash.
memory serves, and no, I could be mistaken about that. I could be mistaken about that. But it basically means a reptile. Serpent is the ancient word for reptile. We often assume it's a snake. That could be right because he was cursed to crawl on his belly. So a lot of people think that. We don't really know that for sure. We know reptile, yes, because that's what serpent means. And then in Revelation, he's referred to as a dragon. So yeah, there is a parallel between Satan is referred to as a dragon, and
Right.
presumably Satan either appeared as or inhabited the body of a literal animal, a literal reptile, to tempt Eve, and then that's brought out in Revelation.
Okay. And I want to get to Behemoth and Leviathan, but you just made me think of one other thing that I'm only asking because you might know the answer. It's not necessarily on topic here. Why did Adam and Eve not think it strange that an animal was talking to them?
That is a commonly debated question. We don't know the answer to it. There are several theories. There's the naive Eve theory, which is that Eve just, she's only a day or two old, so she just doesn't know that animals can't talk. There's the theory that animals did talk before sin. I think I'm inclined to think that she knew more than, I mean, she was an intelligent being. Granted, she's very young, but God gave her some innate knowledge. It's quite possible that she understood that there was an angelic being that was occupying the serpent and enabling it to speak. There are animals today that can mimic human speech. There are certain birds that can mimic human speech. It's just they don't have anything intelligent to say. They repeat what they hear. But animals do have that capacity. But I think my suspicion, and I don't know for sure, is that Eve knew more than we assume. That she knew that this animal was being inhabited by an angelic being. What we would learn later would be Satan, and that Satan was using that as a mechanism to speak to her. But we don't really know.
Okay. Well, I didn't know before you answer my question. I think your theory is very interesting and probably as close to being right as anybody. So let me ask you, Dr. Lyle, if you don't give me just a second, for the listeners, I want to read the verses in Job about Behemoth and then talk about that and see if we can come to some answers about what he is, because I believe the secular view is that it's a rhino or a hippo or something, or maybe that's Leviathan. But anyway, let me read real quick. This is Job 40, verses 15 through 24. Behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He's the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. For the mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can you take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? What creature are we talking about here?
In my opinion, it's most likely a long-necked, long-tailed dinosaur, the sauropodomorphs, the long necks. And those are the ones, those are, as far as we know, the largest land animal that God created. Now, the largest animal God created is still alive. It's the blue whale. But the largest land animal are these long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs, with four legs. And the reason I believe that, not only is it completely consistent with what we read in that passage, the fact that the passage says he's the first of the ways of God or the chief of the ways of God, that may be an indication this is the largest thing that God made, in that, or at least largest land animal, and we do think those are the long-necked dinosaurs. But also verse 17 where it says he moves his tail like a cedar, that's a tree. So when he moves his tail, it's like moving a tree. And I've heard counter arguments to that, but they do not stand up to scrutiny. This is an animal that had a massive tail like a cedar tree, like the tree trunk when he moves it. And that doesn't fit any modern land animal. There's no modern land animal that has a tail like a tree, but certain dinosaurs did, like the long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs. Yeah, and then a lot of Bibles in the footnotes it'll say, behemoth, possibly an elephant or hippopotamus, but they do not. Elephant and hippopotamus do not have a tail like a cedar tree. So I can't be sure that it's a long-necked dinosaur, but I am confident it's not an elephant or hippo.
Yeah, why do you think they put that in the footnotes? I mean, that's not secular people saying that. Why would they interpret it that way?
Um, Especially in the older translations, they may not. I mean, there was a time before the 1800s we hadn't discovered dinosaur fossils yet, so they may not have known that. But it's probably the most. They're assuming that's got to be a creature that's still alive today, and then the best they can think of is elephant or hippo, because those are large creatures and they're powerful creatures, especially the elephant. Well, hippos too. But yeah, they do not have a tail like a cedar tree. So it's just something that people overlook, and that we need to remember the footnotes are not inspired. They can be wrong. They were inserted later by people who are well-meaning, and they can be helpful. Footnotes can be helpful, but they can be wrong. And so this is an instance where I would say those footnotes they do not they're not consistent with verse 17.
Yeah, and I don't think they are either. I like the biblical explanation of a dinosaur so much better. But you do hear people say that dinosaurs aren't mentioned in the Bible. You won't find the word in there. So that's why I kind of wanted to ask that before I asked you specifically about behemoth. But if you would indulge me for one more, Dr. Lyle, I want to talk
Mhm.
about Leviathan and see if we can discover what this is. So this is from Job 41. It says, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of man is false. He is laid low, even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who is first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. What creature are we talking about here, Dr. Lyle?
My suspicion is it's one of the plesiosaurs, probably one of the long-necked plesiosaurs like an elasmosaur. These were marine reptiles. They're air-breathing, so they're reptiles, but they lived in the ocean or in lakes, perhaps. And they had like four flippers and then like a long neck and usually a short tail. And well, not all of them had a long neck, but some of them did. I think it's one of the long-necked ones because later, I think it's in verse 20. I don't have the text in front of me, but verse 22 or verse 25, strength dwells in his neck, sorrow dances before him. And in the context of this passage, this is God speaking in this passage, and as well as in chapter 40 with regard to the behemoth. And he's basically giving Job a little quiz. Job wanted to have a conversation with God and plead his case because he was suffering. and he was wondering why God was allowing that. And God basically condescended and said, "Okay, Job, I'll have a conversation with you, but before, let's see if you're qualified. Let's see if you can possibly comprehend conversation with me." And he begins explaining some of the things, asking Job to explain some of the things that God created, including these incredible creatures like the behemoth and Leviathan. And then in verse, again, I don't have the text in front of me, but verse 9 or 10, who is so fierce that would dare stir him up? No one is so fierce that would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? So God's basically saying to Job, you can't even deal with one of my creatures. What makes you think you can deal with me? So this was obviously a very powerful creature. There are verses here that say that sparks come out of its mouth, that smoke goes out of its nostrils. So it could produce something like a flame. Apparently, people say, well, that can't be a fire breathing dragon. That's got to be fiction. And then I would say scientifically, why? Why? Because there are animals that God's made that have amazing abilities. There's a bombardier beetle that can produce a hot spray. Why couldn't God do that with a larger animal? Of course he could. So there's no scientific reason to dismiss this. It's a real creature that Job was familiar with. It's a sea-dwelling creature, but it breathes air, and it has apparently a long neck. And I would guess that that would be some kind of plesiosaur, the animals that have the four flippers and the long neck. And those are also animals that have been reported. There are lots of legends of them, legends of sea creatures, and a lot of them resemble known types of plesiosaurs.
Yeah, so let me ask you this. Only about, correct me if I'm wrong, but only about 5% of the ocean floor is mapped. And much of it is undiscoverable or has yet to be able to be discovered by humans. I know if you're in a certain point of the Pacific Ocean that you're actually close to the nearest space station and to a coast. Given all that, and given that there must be so much down there that we obviously haven't seen, do you think that there's any possibility that there's a sea dinosaur that still exists? I mean, there is a story of a group in Australia, I think, that was tagging some kind of shark. It might have been a great white so that they could track their swim patterns and whatnot. And one of them, they were following it, and the temperature of the fish increased greatly, and it went to a depth that was extremely low in just a matter of seconds, which gives the impression that something much larger than the shark swallowed it. Do you think it's possible that there are still existing dinosaurs in the sea?
Yeah, it is. And technically, they wouldn't be dinosaurs because dinosaurs, by definition, are land animals. But there could be something like plesiosaurs, mosasaurs. Those theoretically, those could still be alive. They're probably not terribly abundant, or we would have discovered them by now. But yeah, the ocean is huge. We have been able to use radar to map out the topography of the ocean floor, but the ocean contains more life on Earth than the land. So and there are places on Earth's surface. There are lands that are not terribly well explored, where there could be creatures living that we thought were extinct that are not. So it's more likely to find something like that in the ocean. The ocean is I mean, it's 71% of the Earth's surface is ocean, and we haven't explored in terms of exploring the life down there. We have done some exploration, but it's certainly possible that there are creatures that we thought were extinct that are still alive in the ocean. That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, it's just an enormous area of water and life. It's so huge. Dr. Lyle, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, just one last question. You go around and do apologetics conferences at churches around the country?
Yes, churches, colleges, mostly churches, but sometimes colleges will have us out. Sometimes Christian colleges, occasionally secular college will have us out to speak. And those are always interesting. But yeah, that's what we do. We try to encourage people that the Bible is true, and I, as a scientist, show people how science confirms what the Bible teaches, especially in Genesis. And so, if you go to our website, if you don't mind a shameless promotion,
No, I wanted you to.
biblical biblicalscienceinstitute.com. That's our ministry, Biblical Science Institute. Just add .com, and in the lower left, you can see all of the events that are upcoming and where we're going to be. So yeah, that's what we do.
All right. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Lyle. I really hope to have you on again. I have so many questions, so many. I had to limit them to a 45-minute kind of interview format. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Gospel Echo USA. Please remember to like this video and subscribe and follow us on all of our social media.